Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Kelly Wright, coming to you from my home, of course, in Maryland, and this is due to the COVID-19 global pandemic. As I've been telling you, we're under orders from Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, and rightly so, to stay home. Do not go outside unless it's absolutely necessary, like an emergency or something. And when we do, we should wear a mask and gloves. And that is to protect our lives and your lives, which leads me to my opening observations. This is serious, folks. This is downright deadly. And we're getting to a point now where we've talked to you about what's going to impact us in the African American community more than anything else right now, and is the COVID-19. The virus is making its way through so many urban areas and impacting adversely African Americans. So we'll be talking about that tonight, as we've been talking about it every night, because we're sounding the alarm that we have to be vigilant and diligent about taking care of our communities and, of course, the rest of the United States and the world for that matter. But since the United States now leads the number of deaths with regard to coronavirus, we have to be proactive. And those are my opening observations. My first guest tonight is someone who's dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic on the front lines there in New York City, in Brooklyn in particular. She is Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and she joins me now to talk about what's going on in terms of her constituents. And a lot of them, Congress member, are actually immigrants. So what kind of unique problems do they have, and how are you dealing with it and addressing it?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Kelly. Let me say that we live in blended households here in central Brooklyn. Someone's a US citizen, someone is a resident of New York, of the United States, and someone is undocumented. What makes New York City and Brooklyn in particular so unique is that we have multi-generational families all living in one household. And for immigrants in particular, that's where most families start, by sharing resources, sharing households. And so that presents a particular challenge here in immigrant communities across the nation, in that one, our immigrants, particularly those who are undocumented, are not provided for in the CARES Act. And so those individuals may be most challenged in terms of accessing healthcare in the midst of this pandemic. The other, of course, is that financially they're not provided for. These are individuals who were gainfully employed prior to the shutdown. And so a lack of resource getting to those individuals, and in some cases, it may even impact their children who are citizens and US born.
So how are they coping as they deal with coronavirus?
Well, it's overwhelming. Luckily, in a place like New York City, they can have access to health care. Our goal is to be able to do wellness checks to as many households as possible, to make sure that individuals are aware that they should seek health care. They should seek care should they feel feverish or exhibit any other symptoms, to try to social distance within the confines of their space as best they can, which is, of course, a big challenge.
Representative Clarke, stay with
Yeah.
me. On the end of this break, I'd like to come back now and talk to you about what's going on with postal workers. You're concerned about them. Obviously, the facts that are alarming all of us in the African American community is how disproportionately we are impacted. And of course, there's so much more that you're working on with the stimulus package, the next one that's up. We'll talk about that and more with Representative Yvette Clarke right after the break. Back now with the program, and joining me is Representative Yvette Clarke, who represents the Brooklyn district in the New York area. And we've been talking about the impact that COVID-19 is having on immigrants, but the public health data, Congressmember, also reveals that African Americans are being devastated by this coronavirus. What efforts can we do in our community to get people alarmed and to let them know that this is a wake-up call? We have to protect ourselves and our families within the African American community.
Well, like the immigrant community here in Central Brooklyn, which is actually a blend because, many of our immigrants here in Central Brooklyn are African descendant, right? So you have that blend going on. But again, population density, and I think that may be the case across this nation, when you have households that are intergenerational, and our households have had to be that way for quite some time, you have the risk of the spread of infection. And what we're seeing is a need for a different approach for communities of color, for Black communities in particular, in terms of making them a priority for testing. We have to set up a construct by which they can have access to testing at a much higher rate so that we can begin to isolate ourselves, knowing that we live in multi-generational families, knowing that we live in crowded conditions, so that we can try to keep those who aren't positive from being infected and treat those who are positive as soon as we possibly can. And that has been one of the challenges. When we talk about the essential workforce, I know that across this nation, the essential workforce looks like me. They are workers who are healthcare workers, transit workers, they are postal workers, they span their warehouse workers. These are the folks who are on the front lines in our grocery stores, in our supermarkets, that have to be at work. And thank God they are, because they're giving us a lifeline so that we can meet the needs of one another during this pandemic. However, they were left out of the sort of strategy for containing the spread of the virus. So these are individuals who are leaving community, going out into the public, coming back to the community, having been possibly exposed to individuals who are infected, and risking their lives and the lives of their loved ones by being in the public each and every day.
It is such a dangerous dichotomy that we're experiencing. You were the first in Congress to sound the alarm for the US postal workers. What has happened in regard to you sounding that alarm to reach out and help protect postal workers? And what efforts is Congress now making because of you sounding that alarm?
Well, we know that they're beginning to be distributed PPE, the masks in particular, but I don't believe enough has been done. The Postal Service is struggling itself as an enterprise. And so we are looking at how we provide direct funding to the Postal Service that then meets the needs of its workers, meets the needs of its customers, because in New York, for instance, our post offices are very small spaces that, and many are still very reliant on the Postal Service, whether it's for their post office boxes, whether it's to receive and send packages, receive mail. We have to, really give a new view to how we address physical locations, how we address the health of those who are delivering mail, delivering packages, and I've not received a satisfactory response from the U.S. Postal Service as of yet. I know that they are focused on it now as we raise the flag of what is happening to our postal workers, how we keep them safe, and by extension, keep the public that they interact with safe.
Absolutely. And of course, it all factors into the election as well, that we're still anticipating we'll have an election in November. Now, if they can't deliver the mail, there's no way to conduct votes.
Absolutely. I mean, it affects everything. Remember, there are some folks who may be receiving their direct benefit by mail. Not everyone has a bank account. So there's so many ways in which the lifeline that we all require in a time like this is relying upon a robust, a healthy postal service. And so we have to really raise this issue up and make sure that our workers who are putting their lives on the line and are dedicated are protected, and that we give them the resource they need to stand up a very strong postal service in this time.
I'm talking to Representative Yvette Clarke, who is there in the Brooklyn district representing the constituents of Brooklyn, or immigrants and people of color, blended families, blended communities, a crowded area. And she's doing all the hard work that has to be done in order to call attention to them and bring them the services they need in the wake of coronavirus. I'll be back with her one more time. Congresswoman, bear with me there, because I'd like to talk to you on the other end of this break about the stimulus package, the new one that's coming out, and how it might impact minority-owned businesses. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back. I'm talking to Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. She is representing the Brooklyn district there in the New York City area. As many of you know, New York City is right now the hardest hit. And while the numbers seem to be leveling off and the flattened curve is apparently happening, we still know that there's a lot of hard work to do in the New York City area. Now, nationally, Representative Clarke, you are concerned about the stimulus package and how it helps small businesses as well as minority-owned businesses, which tend to be the backbone of American enterprise. What's happening with this new tranche of 2-point-something trillion that will come out in the hopefully the near future?
Well, that was the CARES Act that passed earlier in March. It's a $2 trillion package, which provided for unemployment benefits. It provided for a direct benefit to families, as well as a substantial amount of money for our small business through the Small Business Administration. What we realized, as this program got rolled out by the Trump administration, was that we had not understood that the SBA would use its traditional lenders exclusively, and the big banks have for generations now been redlining communities of color, have been very slow to lend to our enterprises. And the way that they went about, first of all, standing up their operations was to go to existing relationships that they had with business and lending relationships. That left a huge swath of our small business community unable to access direct lending from our major banks. We recognized that immediately once the rules came out in terms of how people would access the small business lending that was intended for them, that we need to do some major adjustments so that we can get funding through our minority serving institutions, be they smaller banks, community community development financial institutions, be they also our credit unions, whatever vehicles we had at our disposal that our folks could access, because that type of discrimination, that type of history of lack of lending to small businesses, for our businesses that are cash and carry, they would be left out.
It's a Herculean task, as I've stated here before, with some of your colleagues like Congress member Bobby Scott, as well as Congressmember Karen Bass. I'm talking to Congressmember Yvette Clarke there in the Brooklyn district. We've never seen this type of new normal, which is quite abnormal.
Absolutely.
What are your words of hope and faith for the American people as we move forward with this? Because we will get through this, but on the other side of it, there are still disparities within our communities that we have to contend with here and now and later.
Well, Kelly, one of the things that we have learned is that there is no going back to normal. One of the things we know is that we are still in emergency phase, moving into a relief phase, and then the next phase is rebuilding. So many flaws in our society have been uncovered through this pandemic that we cannot allow us to go back to the way we lived pre-COVID. It is critical that we use the knowledge that we have today, that we've always had, but that sort of the powers that be, if you will, have chosen to ignore throughout the generations. Now we are paying a dear price for not adhering to what we knew were vulnerabilities in our civil society. Going forward, as we rebuild business, as we get corporations up and running, we have got to, one, pay attention to a robust public health system that focuses in on those communities that were hardest hit by this pandemic. We have to look at what it means to be an essential employee and how we address hazard pay and all other means of keeping them safe and secure, monitoring their health progress throughout this, and then looking at the myriad of ways in which these disparities have kept America from reaching its God-given potential because of the baked-in discrimination and racism that to this very day in the 21st century, this generation is paying a dear price because of.
I appreciate you so much for your comments and spending a great deal of time enlightening us and informing us and keeping us as well inspired about what we must do now and what we must continue to work on for later.
Absolutely, Kelly. It's this generation's work. We must use those of us who are fortunate enough to come through this pandemic. Our work has to be focused on bringing equity to our society and addressing those systemic problems that have been a part of our lives. And we have what it takes to do that. I'm looking forward to everyone putting their shoulders to the wheel so that the generations that will come after us will inherit from us a much greater nation than the one that we inherited.
Thank you so much, Congressmember Yvette Clarke. And my heart and my prayers to the good people of Brooklyn. As you know, I've worked in New York for a number of years and love it as if it's one of my own adopted cities. So I am praying for each and every one of you. And please stay safe and stay vigilant and diligent in all the great work that you're doing there to help the people, from immigrants to all Americans and from African Americans to all communities, not only throughout Brooklyn, throughout this nation. Again, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you for having me, Kelly.
We'll be back with more after this. Joining me now on the Kelly Wright Show is Michael McMillan. He is the president and CEO of the Urban League of St. Louis, and they have been doing a lot of work in the wake of COVID-19. Michael, good of you to join me today. Tell me what's going on out there in St. Louis and how the Urban League is helping to mitigate the virus and help the people deal with it in terms of the African American community and other communities that are impacted by this virus.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always good to be with you. I appreciate all that you do in the community and all that you do across the country. And you have many fans here in St. Louis. I'm proud to be the chief among them, and we're proud to be on the show. You know, obviously, this COVID crisis is impacting the entire country and the entire world, and then tragically, in St. Louis and in many other cities across this country, it's having a more devastating impact in African American communities. So much so that every single person that has died from this disease in the city of St. Louis is African American so far. And if you look at the zip codes that have the highest numbers of cases, they are in the African American community. So this disease is impacting us in an even more significant way. And then the other thing, of course, is the fact that so many African Americans have jobs that they cannot work from home at. So since we have positions that put us on the front line so often, they are not executive positions that one can do from home. So individuals who are really out there risking their lives in order to take care of themselves and their families are even more so at risk, which contributes to the increased numbers of African Americans here in St. Louis and across the country.
That's incredible. And we've been talking about it a lot on this program. For about 2 weeks, we had predicted that this was going to adversely impact the African American community, not only because of the health disparities that we knowingly have, but also due to the very fact that you just stated. We're in those essential jobs, and the community at large needs our input and our work, but at the same time, we're at greater risk. So tell me what the Urban League has been able to do to kind of mitigate that risk, even though you're already seeing that the African American community is leading in terms of the coronavirus there in St. Louis.
Certainly. So when you look at unemployment numbers, unfortunately, tragically, African American men 18 to 24 have been the highest of all percentage in general before the crisis. And now that you're talking about 16 plus million individuals that have filed for unemployment in the past 3 weeks, our community has been devastated by that. So we have seen a huge need in terms of just the basic necessities for individuals to survive: food, housing, utility assistance, toiletries, diapers, formula, things that people need just to make it every single day. And then, of course, there's the fear of infecting themselves and their families by being out for those that still do have jobs and do have to go out and do have to take care of other people. So we've been able to thus far provide over 2,500 sets of food, and we've been giving away these large distributions now. We had our second one actually yesterday, where we served over 1,500 people. The first one we served 1,075. We've given away $115,000 worth of food, toiletries, and PPE, because we need to try to also provide these low-income neighborhoods that don't have access to gloves and masks and sanitizer and other things, those resources as well, so that they can stay healthy.
It's incredible work that you're doing. I'd like you to stay with me for the next break, the next segment, and talk to you more about moving forward in terms of what happens after the coronavirus passes. How do we then deal with our people? I'm talking to Michael McMillan. He is the president and CEO of the Urban League of St. Louis. We'll be back with more right after this. Back now with Michael McMillan, who is the president and CEO of the Urban League of St. Louis. And you've been hearing how Michael and those members of the Urban League in St. Louis have been proactively engaged on the front lines and helping so many people within the African American community deal with this coronavirus. And Michael, getting back to what you were talking about before, I found it alarming when I heard it, when you said that the number of people who have died in that community have all been African Americans. That is stunning to me. Certainly we've heard about the large numbers in Chicago, Milwaukee, New Orleans. We're hearing about things going on in Philadelphia and Baltimore. The list will probably grow bigger as the African American community continues to be disproportionately impacted by this COVID-19. Tell me, just the sheer numbers alone, what you've had to deal with in talking to people who are coming to you and your organization saying, I'm COVID-19 positive, where do I turn?
Well, there are so many individuals that are reporting to us on a very regular basis, some of our partners. In fact, just this very week, one of the top African American commanders in the history of the police department died. One of the pastors that we work with, who is on the front lines in terms of mediating the disputes between gang members and individuals who were going to literally kill each other, he died. And it has impacted other city employees and police and frontline workers. And the first person to die in the region was a healthcare worker who was an African American nurse. So as you look at this, and the numbers and the devastation, we have to be very careful. As we know, there was also this myth at first that Black people could not catch the disease, that our melanin was going to protect us from it. And that has been shown to be absolutely false. And the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, the health disparities in our community of diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease are making this disease even more dangerous to us.
Michael, St. Louis is a very vibrant city. It has a large African American population that has contributed so greatly to America and the world. And just the names of the people, or the people you were talking to me about, leaders in that community who are now dying due to the coronavirus. Getting through this is going to be painful and arduous enough.
Yeah.
After we get through it, as Dr. Anthony Fauci has stated, those disparities will still exist in our African American community, and something must be done about that. If you will, how will the Urban League address that in the here, the now, and the after?
Absolutely. I think that what this disease has shown to us as a nation, and I really appreciate Dr. Fauci pointing this out, is that we as a country have failed the African American community in terms of these health disparities. When you look at these food deserts that exist, and you have individuals that can basically only go to a corner store for all of the food and the nutrients that they need. And if you look at the price of healthy food being much more than food that really is not good for you, and not having vegetables and not having fruit and not having exercise and not having the ability to pay for a gym membership or even having a gym in your neighborhood and having physical exercise and a focus on that. And then when you look at the concentration of poverty, when you look at the working poor individuals that are making $10, $11 an hour that have to work 2 jobs just to survive and don't have time to go to the gym and exercise, and all of these things that contribute to these horrible conditions in the African American community from a health standpoint, there's going to have to be a national push, a national program from the federal government to deal with these disparities. Cities and states cannot do it alone. Congress and the president are going to have to try to pass legislation and do prevention and get out there and give the African American community a true focus with funding and programs to deal with prevention and to deal with diseases that are just killing so many Black people at disproportionate numbers all across this country.
And not to mention, Michael, to add to that, everything that you stated is so on point. But then there's also the racial aspect of it as well, the systemic racial divide and racism that has been inflicted upon the African American community, as well as the brown community. People of color have experienced this in this country. And because of this racial animus that's out there and this bias that's out there that has kept us in some of these dire situations, we are now seeing it front and center. What do we do about that? I mean, the leaders of the African American community, as well as those communities beyond our communities, need to be sounding an alarm to do something about this.
Absolutely. I think we need to push for advocacy from the government, from the federal level, and we need to push for all of us taking this even more seriously than we ever have before and focusing on it in terms of the Congressional Black Caucus, the National Urban League, the NAACP, and other advocacy organizations, and then partnering, as you mentioned, with our Latino colleagues as well to try to make sure that we do this across the board and have funding in states and cities, and that it also trickle down and go into the educational system, that grade school, middle school, and high school focus on physical education, good nutrition with our young people in terms of giving them the proper food and the proper nutrients so that then they will grow up and not have to start these things so early. Because as you know, obesity is starting in the grade schools now. When you look at the number of people that have actually now become obese as children, and it's much more difficult to get out of that situation if you start off as an obese child. So we've got to deal with this as a major health crisis and push for advocacy and programs to deal with it head on.
I'm talking to Michael McMillan, who is the president and CEO of the Urban League of St. Louis. And the Urban League in St. Louis is one of the leading Urban League chapters throughout the country, if not probably one of the top aspects of the Urban League, and they do such a great job. We're going to talk a little bit more about that and the history of the Urban League there in St. Louis and why it's making such a tremendous impact. Michael McMillan, my guest on the Kelly Wright Show, back with more after this. Welcome back. For the past two segments, I've been talking to Michael McMillan. He is the president and CEO of the Urban League of St. Louis. And Michael and I have shared a little bit of history. We met in the wake of Ferguson, and I watched what he did along with his many workers and volunteers and colleagues there in St. Louis who are members of the Urban League and the greater St. Louis community. And Michael, at that time, I noticed that you were a bridge builder in healing the wounds that so divided Ferguson. And as a result of that, you and the faith community and the business community, top Fortune 500 companies, came together to right some wrongs. Tell me about that so we can talk about a little bit more of what you're doing with this COVID-19 pandemic.
So thank you for that compliment. I mean, we're very, very fortunate here in St. Louis to have the largest urban league in the country, the first one to have a 5-star rating. We have served this community for over 102 years. We serve 100,000 clients each and every year in 15 different offices with 50 programs with an amazing coalition of government, business, corporate, and philanthropic supporters that give us the ability to serve our mission and to do it extremely well. We've got 250 dedicated staff that work each and every day on the front lines trying to make a difference and help build those bridges that you talked about. And that's what the Urban League was created to do, was to serve African Americans and those that are in need in major urban cores across this country and bridge the gap between the African American community, the corporate community, the government, the business world, and philanthropists in order to try to provide those resources for those that need it most. So that is our mission. That is what we have been doing. That's what we're doing today. That's what we will continue to do because the need is overwhelming. I would love to work our way out of existence and that we would solve all these problems and everybody would be financially independent. Racism would not exist. Sexism would not exist. And any form of discrimination would not exist. But we are a long way from that, especially when you look at the numbers. A liar will figure, but the figures don't lie. And when you deal with what is going on in these different communities with unemployment, with educational disparities, healthcare disparities, and the rest, there's an overwhelming need for the mission of the Urban League. And so we will continue to be there for our clients and serve them. And we're actually now filming from the Ferguson building. And it continues now 3 years later, serving this community, being a beacon of hope, providing for the service collaboration between the Urban League, the Salvation Army, the SBA, and the Lutheran Church to try to help improve lives and take a tragic situation and try to turn it into a triumphant situation. And literally, as you know, this building was a phoenix rising out of the ashes from the burned down Quick Trip now to this community empowerment center that serves thousands of people a year between the four of us and all of the different individuals that come through this center each and every day.
And that's why I wanted you to talk about that so people could see that there's a history there, that you've been tied to this community for so long, and you personally have been serving the city of St. Louis for most of your adult life. I want to get into something specifically that you're doing about the COVID-19 pandemic. You have acquired a large building, and with that building, you'll be able to do a lot of different services in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. Tell me about that, please.
So we are moving our headquarters for the first time in almost 50 years to what is affectionately known in the Black community as the old Sears building, the Victor Roberts building at 1408 North Kings Highway. It is the only standing facility that was at one time a full service retail facility in the community. So it literally was an old Sears from 1928 through 1976. And that was where so many people went to buy everything that they needed in their lives. And it was a meeting place and something that we really took pride in. And then the Urban League and the Roberts had this, and they then have had it for about the past 40 years. And so now we are acquiring it in the month of May to return there and have our headquarters there for the region. And with 205,000 square feet, it gives us a huge ability to have a one-stop shop for people to go to get everything that they need to be independent so that they can get food, they can get clothing, they can get shelter in terms of our housing programs, they can get a job with Save Our Sons, Save Our Sisters, and our other employment programs. They can get college scholarships, GED training. They have daycare in the building. St. Louis University has a health clinic so that you can go get free health care in the facility. There are a number of small businesses that operate in that building as well. And we would have all of our 50 programs represented in the most iconic facility in the Black community to provide for a beacon of hope and a beacon of opportunity so people can become independent.
I absolutely love the work that you're doing out there, and really applaud the efforts that you're doing to not only take care of the community as it goes through this COVID-19 pandemic, but also looking ahead to see what needs will be assessed and met beyond this coronavirus. Because as we've stated, we will get through this. We'll do it together, but at the end of the road, we still have to build up a community that is suffering the loss of so many leaders, as you stated, leaders who have been helping the community of St. Louis. And certainly we're seeing that across the country, how so many promising people who had offered hope have gone away because of the coronavirus taking their lives. Michael, I would be remiss if I didn't end on a hopeful note, and certainly you've been doing that. Give the people in the nation something to remind them that hope still prevails in the midst of despair.
You know, I think when you look at this crisis and it being something that we have never lived through before, many of us have lost hope, but we have been through things that are more difficult than this. And when you look at the future, I believe that it is going to be a brighter future than the past. And when you look at this tragedy and all the lives it has taken and all the illness that it has created, it has been devastating. And it is going to be that way for some time. But by literally coming together as Americans and showing the best side of ourselves, I believe that those of us who have been blessed with whatever resources that we have that we can actually share with others, we will do that. And we will help our fellow Americans get the type of resources that they need from the government and then from not-for-profits and collaborations and individuals to try to give them all of the hope and the opportunity so that they can return to the lives that they once had. And we will get through this together.
Michael McMillan, President and CEO of the Urban League of St. Louis. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Praying for you as always. Good to see you, my friend. God bless you.
See you too.
Welcome back to the program. In case you hear some noise in the background, it's because of a torrential downpour that's happening here. We're under a tornado watch as I speak. But joining me, a stalwart individual who's part of the RNC. His name is Bruce LeVell. He's also an advisor to President Trump. And Bruce, as we go through this COVID-19 pandemic, we're hearing how devastating it's been on the African-American community. In fact, the White House held last week a conference call, and the Vice President of the United States was on that call speaking to members of the African-American community about the dire need for everyone to be on board in mitigating this coronavirus throughout the African-American community. What else are you hearing from the Trump administration as it pertains to dealing with this crisis within the Black community?
Well, and thanks for having me, Kelly. Well, one of the things is really dispelling the myth that Black folk can't get it, you know, and I don't know where that come from. You probably heard the Surgeon General address that in the press conference. But however, we don't want to ever take for granted that everyone has cable, everyone has Wi-Fi, and just the press conference that you see in terms of getting information out. So you're absolutely right. I was on that call, and there were tens of thousands of folks on that call, literally. And to make sure that key leaders were able to go back and articulate the message back to their congregations, their civic groups, their communities, et cetera, that, hey, this is serious, it affects everyone. And I will say, once again, I'm a church guy. I love the fact how the churches have stepped up and, you know, worked around this pandemic, but also had not stopped being what they're designed for, which is helping the community and the people.
As we get through this,
Yeah.
how do we make sure that we right the wrongs that perhaps led up to these conditions in our communities in the first place? We have to take ownership of it in our own communities, and Congress at large, the government has to take ownership for its responsibilities as well.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think at the end of the day, I'm a very optimistic person. I see such a tremendous light that's going to come out of this. And we said earlier on your show, in terms of the relationships, the bonding, the conversations about folks that never had a conversation with the Lord, or just who God is in general. This is being talked about all across this great nation, in living rooms and family rooms, etc. And I just see a tremendous light that's going to come out of this on how we take care of each other. Kelly, how our faith-based community, once again, our churches are so vital in our communities. And I think it's going to be a great jubilee in terms of bringing back relationships and making us stronger.
I like your optimism, and I thank you for sharing with us and some insights on what's happening within the Trump administration as it pertains to dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, not just for America, but also for African Americans, as they've been hit very hard by this. But Bruce, in addition to the health education, I would go one step further. We need a whole person education, mind, body, and spirit. Those three elements, I think, could help us meet your optimism as well as our practical aspects. If we understand it in our mind, understand it in our faith, and understand how we deal with this in a health terms, I think we can actually get through this, but a lot of work yet to be done.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for everything you're doing. And by the way, you need to share that song that you sent, man. That song, man. Oh my gosh, it was incredible.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for blessing me with that.
I send that everywhere. Every time I get a doom and gloom text, I like, boom, check this Kelly Wright song out. Boom, check this scripture out. Boom, bada bing, So it's like, it's the only thing. I just had an interview earlier today. I said, at some point, with all the doom and gloom on CNN, MSNBC, all the networks, let's bring about the blessings. Let's talk about all the great things we have as a country and as a people. And we're resilient people, especially Black folk. We've been through a lot. We can go through this, Kelly. I know we can. And we're going to be stronger. We're going to be faster. We're going to be more physically fit. And we're going to, most of all, a lot of us are going to come back to the Lord. And a lot of folks are going to entertain who the Lord is. So I'm very excited about this. I really am.
Love your faith, man, and thank you so much.
Love you, brother. I appreciate you. Thanks for having me on this great network. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Bruce. Bruce LeVell on the Kelly Wright Show. Back with more after this. And now it's time for my final word. Hopefully we've learned a lot today from Congresswoman Yvette Clarke there in Brooklyn, New York, as well as from Michael McMillan, the president and CEO of the Urban League of St. Louis. What a great work they're doing out there, getting at it on the front lines to help save lives and to help people in dire need. And then, of course, there's Bruce LeVell, who's talking about the faith, and he, of course, represents the RNC. The bottom line, folks, no matter what political stripes we wear, whether we're liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat, we have to understand that we must fight this thing together. And that's through our faith, that's through our hope, that's through our love, and it's also through our mind as we listen and learn how this virus acts. Let's continue to strive to flatten the curve in all communities. And hopefully you've been invited and ignited to spread not fear, but drop some knowledge on people and then spread some love, freedom, and peace. And we leave you now as we see love, freedom, and peace in action through the Urban League of St. Louis. Peace out.
In my America, my children are black and white, one shade of beautiful, so precious in God's sight. In my America, all lives matter, so let's stop the chatter that tears us apart.